Life Audio.
Hello, friends. I'm Alan Fadling, and you're listening to the Unhurried Living Podcast, where we inspire you to rest deeper, live fuller, and lead better. Obviously, we talk a lot about hurry here. It's in our name. But we continue to believe that it's one of the great challenges of living in our contemporary world, and we're always looking for resources that will help us fulfill our mission to rediscover the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and work. Today, I'll be talking with Steven Lawson, creator of a resource called the Monk Manual, a daily planning system that helps us focus on the most important things so we can live each moment with greater purpose, productivity, and presence. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm glad you found us. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'd love if you'd share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. Before we get into today's interview, let me share more about our guest. Steven Lawson is the founder of the Monk Manual, a daily planner inspired by monastic wisdom designed to help people live intentionally and unhurriedly. By blending productivity, mindfulness, and personal growth, Steven's work empowers individuals to align their actions with their values, fostering balance and clarity in a fast-paced world. Through the Monk Manual, Steven offers practical tools for cultivating presence, deepening relationships, and finding purpose in the everyday. His vision invites us to embrace the grace of slowing down and living with greater joy and fulfillment. Join us as we explore his transformative approach to intentional living. Now, let's dive into my conversation with Steven Lawson. Well, Steven, thanks so much for taking time for this conversation. I've been really looking forward to it.
I have as well. Thank you so much, Alan, for having me. This is going to be great.
Fun. Well, I would love to start our conversation to just maybe hear a little bit of your own story of how you came to develop this resource, the Monk Manual, this way of arranging our life and work. Can you tell a little of that story?
Yeah, sure. Well, I can tend to be a little bit verbose, so I'm going to go and do a compressed version.
Okay.
I'll say, okay. I said I'm going to do a compressed version, but I'm going to take one quick detour. I was actually, it was English class in high school. I encountered this quote when we were reading, I actually think it was Animal Farm, but we read this quote by John Stuart Mill that was from Utilitarianism, that went something along the lines of, I'd rather be a human being, I would rather be a human being dissatisfied than a pig fully satisfied. I'd rather be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool fully satisfied. And that struck a chord with me because it, even at a very young age, it made me feel a sense that I wanted my life to be oriented towards maybe not only reality, but to face uncomfortable truths and try to just really figure out like what is the right way to do this and the right way to live, even if it's uncomfortable, right? And in part of that, and there, obviously there's a lot of different things that happen in a person's life, but I ended up becoming very interested in productivity at a particular phase of my journey. And what ended up happening was I realized at a certain point that my interest in productivity was actually a desire for peace, in that the way I was approaching productivity was actually producing the opposite effect. So it was almost as if I was doing this thing thinking it was going to get me a particular result, when in fact it was actually producing the opposite result. But I just wasn't clear on the reason why I was doing it, right?
Wow.
Around that same time, I'd been reading. I'd been interested for a while in studying psychology, and I came across the model for human flourishing that comes out of positive psychology, and when I saw that this model for what human flourishing looks like, I couldn't help but see an overlap between that and what it seemed that monasticism was actually oriented towards, right? So the different things that positive psychology was promoting, I was like, actually, monasticism seems to be a system that's actually engineered in a sense around these things. Obviously, not just those things, but engineered around those things. And then also from as a person of faith, going into understanding kind of different spiritual masters within the Christian tradition. I saw kind of this very interesting Venn diagram where I saw that there was a model for being and becoming, like a different way of approaching productivity that seemed to come in line with a lot of these principles held in monasticism. So that's really the heart of it, which I think, seeing that and just having experienced that myself, there's a real impulse and honestly a call to try to take what I was seeing there, what I was seeing in the lives of monks, and just explore how that could be transferred over into our everyday life, the people who are living more in the world. So that was the original impulse behind it.
That's really helpful. Thank you for sharing some of that story. So on your website, monkmanual.com, for those who are listening, one of the things you say, and I really resonate with it, you said we often confuse busyness with productivity. I mean, I couldn't agree more, but could you say more about the mistake we make of equating busyness and productivity?
Yeah, well, one thing I would say is I actually think it's somewhat psychological. So the way that we relate to time is time is a very amorphous thing, right? It's very hard for us to grasp time. It's not like money where we can go and look at our bank account and be like, oh, this is how much time I have left. It's not like that. It's not something that we can hold on to in that way. We actually experience time almost as if it's like infinite in this life, because what ends up happening is each day we wake up and the time is there and we use it, and however we use it, it's being spent. So we have a very interesting relationship with time. And often when people are thinking about being productive, what I think they end up relating that to is a feeling that a lot of things are getting done, that there's just a lot of activity, a lot of motion. Because there's something concrete about that, right? It's almost like if like productivity becomes connected to a feeling of going fast, and it's metaphorically, I think a helpful image is it's like you can drive very fast going in circles around a city block, but you're not actually going anywhere. You're just going very fast, and you might be getting car sick along the way as well, right? But it's the feeling of busyness that we use as an indicator of whether we are being productive or not, whereas that actually has nothing to do with true productivity, I would argue, right? Like the speed upon which we're feeling it, and usually, and I'm sure this is something that you would agree with, is often it's the case that actually the busier we are, it's usually a sign that we're being less productive, properly understood.
No, I think that's exactly right. I realize a lot of my own busyness is not always rooted in some vision of a good that I want to do. It's more often rooted in some anxious sort of insecurity. Yeah. And that does not generally prove to be my most productive mode.
Yes.
On the website, you also say this, which I appreciated. You said, life is not about getting to the end faster. It's about being here the whole time, engaging each moment, doing our most important work. I've been thinking, that, we imagine that squeezing more into every moment, like gaining more productivity by compression will work rather than by depth, which is what I think I hear you saying. That productivity is more related to being where you are more fully. Could you say maybe more about that?
Yeah, there can be this feeling of disparity that we will sometimes feel, or like maybe an emptiness or a feeling of being out of control. And I think we try to deal with that by consuming more, even if that's just action. Do you know what I mean? We try and fill and fill and fill. And the reality is like if you're at a buffet, for example, it doesn't enhance the experience of eating to just consume more and more and more. In fact, it kind of makes you, first of all, you don't actually taste what you're eating. And second of all, at a certain point, you start feeling sick. And oftentimes, even at buffets, it's not the highest quality food. So I think our experience of life, when it's built off of a model of more, what ends up happening is we feel I think you could actually go so far as to say spiritually sick, as it were. Like there's a feeling, and often a hangover effect to that as well.
Yeah, no, I resonate with what you're saying. That's so true. As I was on your website, one of the other things I came across, and I really enjoyed, you said, maybe this was a little while back. You said, maybe this year we can move slow and heal things.
Mm.
And maybe, just maybe, in that slowness, we can confront the things that are broken and finally find the sustainable change we're after. Strikes me that that's counsel we could probably use right now. Can you say maybe more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That
Oh,
was a little bit of a play off of. You're probably familiar with Meta had a motto. I'm not sure if this is still part of their motto, but it was this move fast and break things.
yes, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So they had this move fast and break things, and I was thinking, isn't that in some sense like our modern problem of
Uh,
it's again this feeling of the faster we're going, of course we must be going in the right direction, and that can be extremely misleading, right? Because if you are if you're going on a journey and you can be going very fast, but if you're driving from California to Atlanta, but the actual path you're on is towards Montreal, Canada, the faster you're going is it's not actually moving you in the right direction, right? So that speed,
yes.
it can be very, very misleading. Now the thing is when we slow down, a few things end up happening. First of all, it's much easier for us to calibrate our inner compass and to listen to that interior voice to figure out where it is that we're really being called, which is primary in the whole work. But the other part of it is a lot of times our speed is it's a way of covering up. It's almost like turning up the dial on noise. It's like right now actually in my office I have a sound machine outside the door. And sound machines, what do they do? They create this noise. Sometimes people use that to go to bed. And I think part of what functionally is going on is it kind of almost drowns out one's own thoughts. And the same thing happens with the noise in our lives. So when you slow down, you become aware of the pain. You become aware of the things that you're not facing, whether that be a broken relationship. It could even be a calling. It could be anything that's actually demanding your attention. Oftentimes we'll turn up the noise so we don't have to hear the signal. Whereas the signal is actually the thing that's being presented to us that's for our greatest good, even if it doesn't feel that way at first. So the idea is, and this would open up a whole kind of can of worms, but I do believe that a lot of the process of our own being and becoming, and ultimately the fullest expression of our doing, is very much linked in healing. It's very much linked in coming to terms and having a certain level of healing, so that we can be more whole as we approach the world. Because our greatest quote unquote productive action we can take is really maybe it's not the term evolution of ourselves, but some sort of it's becoming more fully that which we are, because wherever we go, that's where we are, right? So if you're operating more fully from a spirit of love, from a spirit of generosity, from a spirit of concern, when you're embodying goodness in a very, very tangible way, that's extremely powerful, right? And it has nothing to do with doing so.
Yeah, I've sometimes said that, the greatest resource we have is our own life made more whole. Because then I and someone else can maybe do the same task, but the outcome of that task will be very different depending on who's doing it.
Yes.
And I really hear that in what you're sharing. Well, for me, for decades, one of my rhythms has been once a month, I go to a nearby Benedictine monastery. They just live in a different time zone.
Yeah.
Is my experience. And whenever I'm at our local Benedictine monastery, there's a stained glass window, and on it are 3 Latin words, ora et labora, which is to translate pray and work. To me, it's that being doing thing you've just been talking about. And I had a mentor who used to say that some of us have an unfortunate philosophy of life and work. He calls it a do philosophy. Do. But the pun, of course, is fully intended. Can you say some about that rhythm, the being, the doing, the reflecting, the acting? I think that's a lost art for many of us.
Yeah, I'd agree. So a couple of things. One is one of the things that actually attracted me to monks specifically was that I think something we struggle with, and I don't know if it's more of an American phenomenon or if it's a Western thing or maybe it's a modern thing. I do think some of it is modern.
Hmm.
is we live very fractured selves. What I mean by that is people will have kind of like, here's my spiritual or religious guides over here, and here's my secular. We have these fractured worlds, right? Where we imagine we kind of have our active life and our spiritual life. And what I really think is inspiring about a monk is their imagination is directed more. It's a different way that they approach their everyday life, because they realize it's not that there's this active life and this spiritual life. It's just one life that happens to be active and spiritual, right? And so I would actually argue that in a sense, being and doing are not so much, they're not so much opposing forces as they're almost like verticals and part of the same thing. So as one enters and more fully is maybe developed or is whole in their being, their doing will actually be elevated. And as someone's doing is in a sense elevated, their being will be elevated. So they move together as many things often do. Now, at the same time, what monks have that's very interesting is they do have a rhythmic approach to life that's making sure that it keeps directing one's attention to stewarding and cultivating those two aspects of life. Because just like a garden, like if it still requires cultivation, it requires attention, it requires watering, it requires tilling. We're very much the same. So it's and we're not just angels, we're not just spiritual beings. We're incarnate. We're material. So we're both divine and man. So there's this bringing together of parts. We actually find our being and becoming in our doing, I would argue. But together, I think that's what monks can show us, is that they can work together. We just have to be a little bit more intentional, because we can't benefit from like a monk will have a very clearly laid out itinerary for their day. We don't have the same benefit, right? Like today, your day today is very much probably different than your tomorrow or previous day. So it requires a different type of intentionality, but you can get there with, I think, reflection and the right spirit and the right systems in place, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's always intriguing to me how much there is built into the life of a monk that isn't, quote, productive. Mm-hmm. But monks are among the most productive individuals and communities I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're just famous for their capacity to accomplish something meaningful, deeply meaningful, lastingly meaningful. And that's, I think, maybe where I'm really resonating with what you're sharing. So when we talk in our kind of community about hurry, one of the things we often say is that a lot of the best things get crowded out when we're in a hurry. Reflection comes to mind. Gratitude comes to mind. Presence. You list a number of monastic principles. Those were 3 of the 10 that you list on your website. Can you talk about how this kind of slow down mode is actually more productive, not less productive? Like the activities it makes possible for us are better for us than some of the frantic hurry that we divert to or we revert to, maybe?
Yeah, this is a really, really great question, and it's fascinating to explore, because we do have that tendency, don't we, where we want to, especially when we start feeling anxiety or we feel out of control, we just want to grasp at control. And what we tend to do is we go for the things that can most easily relieve the anxiety, right? So we'll go and take out the to-do list and find some things we can check off, even if it's not the most important thing. Or we'll tell ourselves, I don't really have time for this right now, or I don't really have time for that. But we also know, I think, deep down that there's kind of that quintessential story of maybe you have like a business executive or something who is so involved in their work and everything feels always urgent. But the reality is, it's like their family's never actually going to feel urgent until it's, in a sense, like too late. You know what I mean? Even though it's the more important thing.
Yes.
And so we know that a lot of the things that are most important do not demand our attention. Because they don't generate anxiety until they're really, really in a bad spot. And that could manifest as burnout. That can manifest as maybe some sort of division in a community. That can manifest as it manifests in all sorts of different sicknesses. But it doesn't show up immediately, right? So I think what's really fascinating about it is from a spiritual dimension, and this is why it's so interesting with the work that you do, is in many ways it actually is, I think, very much a spiritual work, because it requires a certain level of faith to do any of these sorts of practices. Like a belief that if I stay with these things, like, because reflection does not, it's not like you put a quarter in and you get like out the M&Ms or something. It's something that you come back to. It's something that that works over time. You have to trust that if you keep watering this plant, it will eventually bear fruit. And that is what happens, but it requires trust. It requires a certain dedication. And so I would argue that it all comes down to some level of allowing and surrendering ultimately, because that's one piece. The other piece, though, is actually, I think, that's the material dimension. On a more of like a spiritual dimension, there's also the reality that when you're creating this space and you're really listening and you're really opening up more, maybe like channels of grace, as it were, that does fuel your action in a way that busyness never could.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you're right. It's well said. There is an element of faith. It makes me think, in a sense, farmers don't directly produce their crops. They indirectly produce their crops. They do a number of things that help their crop be as productive as it can be, but pouring water on dirt doesn't look like creating a crop, but it's critical. And so that indirectness is part of the challenge. Reflection, gratitude, some of these other values that the monks implicitly hold are sort of indirectly productive. But that indirect part is the critical part. It seems to me.
Yeah, I would actually argue that part of what's going on there is we have a very industrialized view of the human person. So
yes,
the word productive skyrockets in popularity between 1760 and 1820, the Industrial Revolution. But the root of it comes from the same as produce, right? So it actually comes out of agriculture. And I think that model of the human person being more of almost like a natural being and becoming, like you don't have to, the way you get an acorn to turn to an oak tree isn't through some sort of assembly line process that requires more hammers and bells and whistles and this and that. It actually is a work that wants to take place. Like it naturally will take place as long as you create the conditions, but that requires a certain amount of trust to trust that it's going to happen. Right. And I will say this, and this isn't embedded really in the question, but I just feel really compelled to say this. I'm passionate about these things because it's been my own journey. And I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this is because the experience of life, when you actually are able to allow and trust that, and move away from this industrial model to one of just actually cultivating and trusting the process of life, it's just a radically different experience of life, right? It feels much more like you're actually, this is how it's supposed to be. This is how it's supposed to be, right? Unfortunately, a lot of people do not experience that. And a lot of people, especially in the ministry world, I think it's very difficult because there's so many demands and there's such a passion people have for helping others. But I think that's probably why burnout's like a very big thing often in ministry as well, because it's like we have a hard time saying no. It can often be a temptation to feel as if we are in a sense like God, like we're Atlas that has to hold up the sky, as it were.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I really appreciate that. We're a whole lot more like that oak tree than we are like an iPhone. An iPhone can run 24/7. It doesn't. You never have to shut it off.
Yes.
Oak trees, they take decades to become mature versions of themselves. And so again, I think we are a lot more like that than we are, as you say, like industrial realities or technological realities. But I think we forget. I think we easily forget. Something else I noticed on your website, I really enjoyed. You talk about the PAR method. It's an acronym for prepare, act, reflect. So there's reflect again. Can you talk about a process like that in terms of our own lives?
Yeah. So the first thing I would highlight here is that I would argue that within our modern culture, we are we idolize, in a sense, action. And some people who are intentional, like say you go into the productivity space, there is a emphasis on preparation. In a lot of spaces, there's an emphasis on preparation, but reflection is something that is not often taught that as much, right? Even in
You're right.
spiritual circles, it's not something that is necessarily celebrated or taught to children or even adults, really, right? It seems kind of like an ancillary thing, like maybe something that's nice for people who don't have a mortgage or don't have to worry about this problem or that problem. What I would argue is that reflection, actually, when you introduce reflection, it completes a cycle. And that cycle is really like this cycle of learning and growing. Because what happens is anytime that we, you think about when you're a child, for example, a child is in a sense, they're not a tabula rasa, they're not a blank slate, but they are. A lot of what we learn comes from the outside world. Like we're always trying to figure out what's the right way to do this. Now, what happens is when the way we learn is by reflecting. So if you're not reflecting, you're really not learning. And the thing is that life is always presenting us with opportunities and data points to go and learn. It's always there. And a lot of times we keep hitting our head up against the wall with a problem. And our impulse is that we need to push more, or we need to control, or we need to this or that. But if we just step back and we really reflected, oftentimes that's a much more efficient use of energy. And not only that, but it's in reflection that we learn to connect with ourselves. We learn to connect with the world. We learn to connect with God in reflection. It slows us down because it forces us, in a sense, into the present. So, and that's really important because so many of us can be torn between the past and the future and be everywhere but nowhere at once, as it were. And that's really a terrible experience of life, right? That's not judgmental. I'm just saying it because I've lived it. It is a terrible experience of life.
Oh, I so agree with you on that. I just don't know how you grow in wisdom without reflection as a rhythm in your life, as you say. You end up in so many autopilot modes, and it is not a life that I want anyway. Well, one of the things you developed, of course, is this system called the Monk Manual. Can you say a little bit about that, what it is, how it works, how our listeners might benefit from a resource like this?
Yeah. So it's funny because when I first created the Monk Manual, as I said, the impulse was to try and take some of the functions behind monasticism and put them into a context that made sense for people living in the world. Because I think a lot of people look at monks and they think that's not really for me. Even if they're attracted, because it feels too foreign, it feels too outside their context to be practical. And I would argue that actually a lot of the forms are actually too outside. They aren't practical for someone who has a family or has certain responsibilities. Like just their role would not allow them to do those things. It wouldn't be appropriate. But at the same time, I thought that there was a great opportunity to maybe bridge that gap and try to leverage some of that same wisdom that's embedded in the system of monasticism. The first product that we created was this thing called the Monk Manual, which we call it Planner, but the main reason we call it a planner is because it has to fit a category that makes sense for people. I would think of it more as like a daily system in a sense, some sort of rhythmic system, like something that has a bundle of practices or things that you do on a daily basis, a weekly basis, and a monthly basis. You could also argue it's kind of a combination between like a planner and a journal. So the first part of each week, each month, each day is a preparation. Then there's an action portion, because the idea is that you prepare intentionally, and then because you've prepared intentionally, you can live into the present moment and just follow the intentions. Obviously, being responsive to what's happening, but still being present, right? Because one of the things I think that's so beautiful about like a monastic life, at least in theory, obviously, I don't want to say that every single monk is living like this perfect ideal, but this idea that if you know, for example, that from 10 to 11, you're supposed to be in manual labor, let's say, like within their framework, they know that there's nothing else they're supposed to be doing. They're exactly where they're supposed to be. And what freedom that is, how much mental energy that frees up, how much creative power that frees up, how much even in a sense, like enjoyment that can free up, because you're actually engaging reality as it is, and you're not having to go and think about all the other things. So I was trying to reproduce some sort of essence of that. And then on the back end of each day, week, and month, there's also a reflection portion. You'll notice like some of what's in there is something a little bit similar to the Ignatian Examen. The reflection rhymes with that a bit. And the intention there was, I think there's a real genius to that examen as well. And I find that if you can bridge a practice like that and make it almost more of a living examen, because it's so intertwined with your daily activities, it's just practically speaking easier to, I think, keep a habit like that and really keep a deep engagement in it. And there's a lot more there. I mean, I would argue that I would argue, and this is going to sound maybe ridiculous, but I would argue that there's probably not a quote unquote planner on the market that someone has thought about more. So I could talk a lot about like why each thing is there and all this stuff. But I spent quite a bit of time on it. But that's maybe a high level overview of what it is.
Thank you so much. I really liked your metaphor of it being kind of a combination planner journal. You know, although I'm not using your resource, I realize that some of what you're saying has become an intuitive way that I sort of manage my days and my weeks, my months. And like you, I have found that to be so life-giving, so encouraging. Well, let me just ask you one final question, which is to say, you know, kind of rooted in this conversation you and I have been able to have, if you're going to invite people to take a sort of practical step in the direction of some of these values that you've been talking about, what might you invite our listeners to try on as a next step in response?
I would can I give 2 practical steps?
Let's go 2.
Okay. So the first would be one of the things that I think is one of the geniuses in monasticism is they do not set their sights on trying to do everything, but doing the difficult job of making decisions and just trying to do some things well. And so I think it's a very practical step, and I would do it in this order. But starting with with each day, just setting 3 priorities, like 3 things that you're like, if I just did these 3 things, and those could be more quantitative, like get this thing done or that thing done, or it could be more of a qualitative thing that has to do with a character trait or this or that, or how you want to show up in a particular instant. Whatever it is that you want, that would be kind of the quality. Like if you looked at this, you could say that was a really, I really feel like I honored that day if I fulfilled these 3 things. Start there. Do that for a week, go back, and then incorporate that on a weekly basis. So set a few priorities for each week. Let that be the anchor for your days. Do the same thing then for months. So you set the monthly priorities, then you have the weekly priorities that anchor back to that, and then the daily that anchor back to each week. That'd be the one piece. The other piece is something in the monk manual on the weekly pages. One of the questions is this question, what is God teaching me? And I think answering that question, you could even do it daily, but answering that question once a week, I think especially for your audience, can be particularly fruitful because it opens up the reality that God is always teaching us, right? And if we live that, that's always going to lead us to very good places, because that's really turning towards the signal of our life.
Absolutely. And what I love about what you're sharing is that over time, you begin to see patterns and you see trajectories and you see direction. It's how you gain discernment for how to move forward in a way that's more in keeping with how you've been designed and what you uniquely have, I think, to offer and to give. Thanks so much for sharing those things. Again, today, my guest has been Steven Lawson, and we've been talking about a resource he's developed called the Monk Manual. Steven, it has been such a pleasure to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alan. This is a wonderful work you're doing.
You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. If you found today's episode helpful, please subscribe now. You'll find many helpful links in the show notes so you can get to know us better, as well as our partner, Life Audio, and all of their other faith-centered podcasts. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.